It happened during a dinner with my wife's colleagues from the law firm. I had been feeling uneasy all evening as my wife dominated every conversation, occasionally throwing condescending glances my way whenever I attempted to speak. The expensive restaurant she had chosen felt suffocating. Its dim lighting and pretentious atmosphere perfectly matched her co-workers' attitudes. "My husband handles the domestic affairs," she announced to everyone at the table, her voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. "He's quite comfortable letting me make the important decisions." Polite laughter erupted around the table while I sat there, my face burning with humiliation. I tried to defend myself, mentioning my recent promotion at work. Her eyes narrowed dangerously before she cut me off. "Please don't embarrass yourself," she whispered, loud enough for those closest to hear. "Everyone knows you've got no backbone. That's why I married you." The words hit me like a physical blow. 10 years of marriage suddenly crystallized into this defining moment, her cruel assessment of my character voiced aloud for others to witness. What hurt most wasn't just the public humiliation, but the realization that she wasn't wrong. I had become exactly what she described: a man without a backbone. On the drive home, silence filled the car like poison gas. She scrolled through her phone, completely unconcerned with what had transpired. This wasn't new behavior. It was simply the first time she had been so explicit about it in front of others. For years, I had convinced myself that compromising was the key to a successful marriage. But compromise had become complete surrender, and I hadn't even noticed the transition. That night, lying awake while she slept soundly beside me, I traced back through our relationship. The early days when my accommodations seemed romantic, the gradual shift as she began making decisions without consulting me, the slow erosion of my opinions until they no longer mattered. Each memory burned with fresh clarity. By morning, something had changed inside me. I made breakfast as usual, but when she demanded I remake her coffee because it wasn't strong enough, I simply said, "No." The word felt foreign in my mouth, but strangely satisfying. She looked up from her phone, confusion crossing her face, before hardening into irritation. "Excuse me?" I said no. "Your coffee is fine. If you want it stronger, you can make it yourself." The shock on her face almost made me laugh. Such a small act of defiance, yet it felt monumental. She eventually made her own coffee, slamming cabinets and muttering under her breath about my sudden attitude problem. At work that day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. 10 years of passive acceptance had left me hollow. My colleagues treated me the same way, someone easily overlooked whose ideas were secondary. During a department meeting, I found myself speaking up about the flaws in a proposal everyone else seemed afraid to criticize. The room fell silent. Then the director nodded thoughtfully. "That's an excellent point. I'm glad someone caught that." Walking back to my desk, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: respect. Not just from others, but for myself. That evening, instead of rushing home as she expected, I stopped at a bookstore. I purchased a book on assertiveness and setting boundaries in relationships. When she called, demanding to know where I was, I simply said I'd be home when I finished what I was doing. My wife had been right about one thing: I had no backbone. But what she failed to understand was that spines grow stronger with use. And I was just beginning to straighten mine. The next week was a quiet revolution in our home. Small changes that seemed insignificant alone, but together formed the foundation of something transformative. When she left her dishes in the sink expecting me to clean up after her, they remained untouched. When she demanded I cancel my plans with an old college friend to attend her office party instead, I politely declined. Each refusal was met with escalating disbelief. At first, she treated it like an amusing phase, a temporary rebellion she could wait out. By the weekend, her amusement had curdled into frustration. During breakfast, she slammed her hand on the kitchen counter. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded. eyes flashing with the dangerous intensity I'd learned to fear. "I'm reading the news while enjoying my coffee," I replied calmly, though my heart hammered in my chest. "You know what I mean? This new attitude of yours needs to stop. It's childish and embarrassing." I took a deliberate sip of coffee before responding. "I'm not being childish. I'm being an equal partner in this relationship for the first time in years." Her laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Equal? Please! I make 3 times your salary. I'm the reason we live in this house. I'm the one with the connections and the future. What exactly do you bring to this partnership that makes you equal?" In the past, her words would have crushed me. I would have apologized, retreated, and spent days trying to earn back her approval. Instead, I met her gaze steadily. "My worth isn't measured by my income or social connections, and neither is our marriage." I stood up and placed my cup in the dishwasher. "I'm going for a run. We can continue this conversation when we're both calmer." Her face registered genuine shock as I walked past her. In 10 years, I had never walked away from a confrontation. My usual pattern was to stay and absorb her anger until she felt satisfied. During my run, my phone buzzed repeatedly with her messages, starting with demands to return immediately, then shifting to accusations of selfishness, before finally attempting guilt. I turned off notifications and focused on the rhythm of my breathing. At work the following Monday, my new approach continued to yield unexpected results. The director asked me to lead a small team on the project where I had identified problems. A colleague invited me to join a regular lunch group I had always observed from a distance. People were seeing me differently, because I was seeing myself differently. My wife's strategy shifted from confrontation to manipulation. She began reminiscing about our early days together, planning elaborate date nights, even initiating intimacy that had been absent for months. But behind the sudden affection, I recognized the calculating look in her eyes. She was trying to re-establish control through different means. During dinner at an expensive restaurant she had chosen without consulting me, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know, I only want what's best for us," she said, her voice honeyed with practiced sincerity. "Sometimes, I push you because I see your potential more clearly than you do." 6 months ago, I would have melted under this approach, desperate to maintain her approval. Now, I recognize the subtle manipulation woven through her words. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But I need to discover my own potential, not live up to your vision of it." Her smile tightened, almost imperceptibly, for the first time. In our marriage, she wasn't the one writing the rules, and I wasn't waiting for her permission to live my life. We're launching the initiative I proposed last quarter. My wife's posture stiffened beside me. I had never mentioned this promotion to her family before, always allowing her to control the narrative about my career. "Is that so?" her father replied, genuine surprise flickering across his features. "That sounds rather significant." "It is," I confirmed. "The director has given me considerable autonomy with the project. If it succeeds as projected, it could transform our department's approach entirely." "Well," he said after a moment, reassessing me visibly, "perhaps you'll finally be able to contribute more substantially to your household." A backhanded compliment, acknowledging while simultaneously diminishing. In the past, I would have accepted it gratefully, desperate for even this meager approval. "Our contributions to our marriage have never been purely financial," I stated calmly, "though I appreciate your concern for our well-being." A hush fell over the table. My wife's fingers tightened around her wine glass, knuckles whitening. Her father blinked, unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by me. "Of course," he recovered, raising his glass slightly. "To new beginnings." Later, as dessert was being served, my wife attempted to reassert control through a familiar tactic. She began recounting an embarrassing story about me from early in our marriage, one she had polished over years of retellings to maximize humor at my expense. "He was so flustered," she said, reaching the part where I had apparently made a fool of myself. "I think they've all heard this story before," I interrupted gently but firmly. "Perhaps we could discuss something new." All eyes turned to me. In 8 years of family gatherings, I had never interrupted her, never redirected conversation, never challenged her right to use me as entertaining material. "I was just getting to the good part," she said, her smile fixed, but her eyes flashing a warning. "It's only the good part for you," I replied evenly. "For me, it's an old embarrassment being used for entertainment. I'd prefer we move on." Her youngest sister broke the awkward silence. "I'd love to hear more about your new project at work. It sounds fascinating." As I began describing the initiative, I felt my wife's gaze burning into me. The power dynamic had visibly shifted, not just between us, but in how her family perceived us. For the first time, they were seeing me as an individual with boundaries and accomplishments, rather than an extension of her identity. After dinner, her father invited me to join him for brandy on the deck, an honor previously reserved for family members he respected. My wife attempted to interject, suggesting I help her mother with cleanup instead, but I politely declined. On the drive home, the silence between us was charged with unspoken confrontation. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight with controlled fury. "You humiliated me tonight." "No," I corrected her. "I refuse to let you humiliate me. There's a significant difference." They're all talking about how you've changed, wondering what's happening to our marriage. Our marriage is changing, I acknowledged. It needed to. She turned to face the window, but not before I caught the unfamiliar expression crossing her features. Beyond the anger and frustration lay something new, fear. For the first time in our relationship, she couldn't predict or control what would happen next, and nothing terrified her more than uncertainty. 3 months into my transformation, desperation began to replace calculation in my wife's attempts to regain control. One evening, I returned home to find the lights dimmed, music playing softly, and dinner prepared, my favorite meal from the early days of our courtship. She had recreated our first real date, down to the wine and candles. She greeted me wearing the blue dress I'd once told her made her eyes look like the ocean. Her hair was styled the way I preferred. Makeup, subtle but deliberate. The performance was flawless, designed to evoke nostalgia and longing. "I thought we should reconnect," she explained, leading me to the meticulously set table. "Remember this meal? That little Italian place in the village where we had to wait 2 hours for a table, but you said I was worth waiting for?" I did remember. The memory was genuine from a time before the power dynamics had calcified, when her strength had seemed complementary to mine rather than overwhelming it. For a moment, I felt the pull of the past, the temptation to slip back into comfortable patterns. "It's a thoughtful gesture," I acknowledged, sitting down as she poured the wine. Throughout dinner, she expertly wove together our shared history, highlighting moments when we'd been happy, carefully omitting the slow erosion of my identity that followed. Her hand reached for mine across the table, fingers intertwining with practiced intimacy. "We were good together," she said softly. "We still could be." The earnestness in her voice nearly convinced even me. But beneath the surface sincerity, I recognized the tactical approach. This wasn't reconciliation, it was reclamation. "We had moments of happiness," I agreed, "but they came at a cost I can no longer pay." Her expression faltered before she recovered. "What cost? Loving each other? Compromising?" "It wasn't compromise when only one of us was giving up parts of themselves," I said gently. "It was surrender." A flash of irritation crossed her face before she could mask it. "That's not fair. I've made sacrifices too. My family wanted me to marry someone with better prospects, someone from our social circle. I chose you because I saw something special. You saw something moldable? I corrected her. And yes, you chose me, then spent 10 years punishing me for not being what your family wanted. She stood abruptly, the carefully constructed facade cracking. Is that what you think? That I've been punishing you? I remained silent, letting her reckon with the truth. Later that night, I heard her crying quietly in the bathroom, the sound muffled by running water. She had always hidden vulnerability, viewing it as weakness. I didn't go to her. This pain was necessary, the beginning of her own reckoning. 6 months later, we sat across from each other in our living room, recognizing what might be our final conversation as a married couple. I've signed a lease on an apartment, I informed her. It's a month-to-month arrangement. I'll be moving some of my things there this weekend. She nodded slowly. The sharp responses, the attempts to manipulate, were absent. Instead, there was only quiet resignation. So this is it? 10 years ends with you walking away? I'm not walking away, I clarified. I'm creating space for us to decide what happens next. Staying here, continuing as we are, isn't an option for me anymore. She swallowed hard. Do you think we can actually fix this? Or are you just going through the motions before ending things completely? I don't know, I admitted. But whatever comes next, I'll face it standing tall.